Thank you very much for joining me. Today I am talking to Chris Pearce, who is the scientific and technical lead of the SEAO2 project, that's SEAO2, Nicholas Rutenbeck, who's the project manager, and Willem van Dorp, who is the coordinator. Now, what they're doing is evaluating different ocean-based carbon dioxide removal techniques, or CDR techniques, as they're commonly abbreviated. So let's kick off. I wanted to ask you, many of these technologies are still in the early stages of development. So I wanted to start off by asking you which you think are the most sort of promising opportunities or solutions in this area with these technologies.
Okay. You've jumped in at the deep end then. Thank you. So just to clarify, we are SEAO2-CDR. We are a Horizon Europe funded project that is looking to better understand and evaluate and assess the pathways towards implementation of these marine carbon dioxide removal, or MCDR, techniques. As you're talking about different approaches, there is a company called SEAO2, hence we've got to just sort of differentiate ourselves from them. They are one of the companies who are sort of starting and pioneering the potential to use the ocean in this regard. There are multiple different approaches in which the ocean is already actively, naturally absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. This in itself is driving impacts such as ocean acidification, which we are very aware of and are monitoring as an impact of human CO2 emissions. But the ocean also has this potential to remove CO2 and to enhance the rate of CO2 through human intervention. So that's kind of what we're referring to when we talk about marine carbon dioxide removal approaches. All these human intervention approaches have two different techniques. One relies on essentially enhancing photosynthesis, which is where macroalgae or phytoplankton, the microorganisms that live in the oceans, can use photosynthesis to absorb CO2 and generate organic carbon material. So they lock that carbon into their organic matter. And then we can increase or export or remove that organic material from the surface oceans and put it in a place where that organic CO2 or organic carbon doesn't get dissolved and released back into the atmosphere. The other approaches rely on changing the chemistry of seawater, where we basically manipulate the seawater chemistry to offset this ocean acidification process that's happening naturally. So we can kind of ensure that the ocean has more potential to absorb CO2 from the air without buffering the seawater chemistry. So the companies are tackling different approaches, all of which are very much in the infancy. And we have lots of scientific questions and ethical questions about how these can be implemented, where they can best be implemented, how effective they are, how permanent and durable the approaches are. At present, we are starting to see field trials, small-scale pilot studies, starting to sort of give us the in-situ information needed to better understand the efficacy of these approaches. So are we in a position to say which is the better of these approaches? Probably not just yet. I think we're still testing that, evaluating that, and certainly the function of our project is not to advocate which will be better or not. We're there to give decision makers information on which they can draw to help understand whether or not they should be pursued, to give us that greater understanding. Although I think we are in a position where we are starting to see perhaps more trials happening in the chemical, the abiotic approaches, purely because these are just slightly further ahead in terms of our technological readiness levels in terms of implementation potential. So there are companies already starting to implement this. The biological approaches, these are happening naturally, and some companies are already starting to explore that, but they are perhaps not quite at the scale of the field trials just at this point in time.
Okay, that's interesting because from what you've described, it seems like perhaps the more complex, more, I don't want to say risky, but perhaps they seem like they would be lesser understood at this point. But from what you're saying, those technologies are more advanced. Have I understood that correctly?
Well, technically more advanced, I think, right?
Yes, I think the technically more advanced to the point of implementing these field trials, and there's multiple tiers or multiple reasons behind that, not least because they can actually be conducted on land or in near coastal environments where we have that ability as humans to actually work far more easily. So they're using existing infrastructure, existing coastal management processes and techniques to enable us to sort of deploy or implement the chemical additions, the natural additions material of alkaline materials that can refer to as antacids, or just materials or processes that offset the acidity of the oceans, or to extract the CO2 through on-land manipulation of the seawater chemistry that removes the CO2, which can then be safely stored or utilized in other formats before putting the carbon depleted seawater back into the ocean. So we are able to conduct those field trials because of where they are happening. The biological approaches, actually, a lot of work was done back in the 90s with regards to certain nutrient fertilization approaches, iron fertilization. So this has been work that's been done scientifically in the past. It's now kind of coming back into this marine carbon dioxide removal context. But those field trials are not happening at present just because they would typically be conducted farther away from the coastlines.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if I can add, I think for all these techniques equally, there are still questions about the impact, or questions about unclarity. So things we don't know yet about the impact. So I think this is true for all the techniques that at least that we try to look at in our project.
All right. Thank you. So yeah, interesting that you mentioned the impact. I wanted to go on to ask you, what are the most sort of critical knowledge gaps that you are working to address? Obviously, there are different considerations: environmental, social, economic. What are the key areas for you?
Yeah, well, through this project, the aim is actually not to delve into any of the specific approaches in too much detail. At the time we wrote and prepared the project, marine CDR as a sector was very much in its infancy, and what we've seen is a huge exponential increase in interest in this sector. And as we've just been discussing, lots of companies and research colleagues are starting to conduct these small-scale, controlled in-situ evaluations or field trials to enable us to better understand what the environmental impacts might be, what the efficacy, how much CO2 might be absorbed from this process, and give us all that first in-situ evaluation. And it's really critical we do that because we've got a theoretical understanding from lab-based experiments, but then as soon as you move into the real world, you need to understand how ocean currents, how natural processes and reactions and buffering capabilities might perturb or change that. So it's really a critical step, which is now just starting to happen. In that context, what we're trying to do through SEAO2-CDR is not to duplicate or kind of replicate those field trials, but rather try and bring all the different actors together to unify those evaluation pathways and assessment criteria to say, yes, we know we need to conduct these field trials, but we also need to consider public perceptions towards them. We need to have the correct legal, ethical governance frameworks on which these field trials, and then if they start to progress and kind of get bigger, how would they then be implemented in different countries? How would we deal with a scenario of marine CDR being implemented in one country where the ocean currents might take the CO2 depleted seawater or the effluents downstream into another country's territorial waters, or the same with biological impact? So we need to kind of understand the frameworks in which these projects could be initiated, as well as, of course, give context to how we would monitor them, how we'd actually observe them, how the companies and decision makers would understand the net efficiency if you're going to extract alkaline materials, where they're going to come from, how far they're going to be shipped, how they're going to be transferred from land onto the ships, and kind of
exactly the pure logistics of it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think that from my perspective so far from the project, I think that the legal aspects are that there's a lot of ground still to be covered in clarifying how this will work, how this can be implemented, and also how governments could deal with this on their own level. So I think there's a lot of work to do. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like it. All right. So you mentioned businesses there a couple of times. So obviously, as I sort of understand it, we've got, businesses, we've got the policy side, and then there's the societal acceptance. So I wanted to talk a little about businesses first. What is the role of business in this? Obviously, you've mentioned they're developing some of the technologies. So what's the role of the commercial sector in sort of driving innovation and scaling up these solutions?
It's actually really critical in developing marine carbon dioxide removal approaches. And that's primarily given the fact that to date, there's been comparatively less research or academic research and development funding into the marine CDR sector. So it's companies themselves who have been supported through the voluntary carbon market, who have been innovating and testing and developing these field trials to really better understand if there is potential to use the oceans in this context. So obviously, many of these companies are looking to establish themselves in the market as kind of leaders in the sector. But they're really the ones who've been funding and starting to develop these in situ field trials, working hand in hand with academics. It must be said, they are not looking to do this entirely on their own. They are, very open to academic engagement, to publicly share their results as far as they can. So companies are putting that effort into running these field trials because they recognize the need to take this as a step-by-step process. The scientific knowledge of what could be done is relatively robust. The big question marks, as we're just discussing, is regarding the impacts, efficacy, which we can only start to better understand as you move into these real world settings. So to that end, the companies have been driving the sector. They've been developing it primarily. A lot of these companies have been based in the US, but we're now seeing expansion of that globally. In UK and Europe, there are many more companies coming up. And as I said before, it's an exponential growth in the sector. In order to sort of take the next step, however, I think we're recognizing that there is a need for independent evaluation of those impacts, and naturally that then leads for more academic engagement and more sort of independent scrutiny of what those effects would be. So this is kind of where the sector's now coalesced, and this is where projects such as ours are trying to help facilitate those engagements, to facilitate those advancements. So to that end, we have been working with one of our partners, World Ocean Council, to set up the first Marine CDR Industry Association, which has brought together many of these companies who've been pioneering the sector to really better understand what their barriers to implementation are, what their requirements are, how they collectively view the nascent MCDR sector and how they wish or need it to progress, and then how we can then sort of help engage from an independent academic perspective to get the information needed, not to facilitate implementation, but to facilitate informed decision making on what or if or where these techniques could be implemented.
Yeah, exactly. Because if I can add to that, there's a large, I think, from what I understand, there's a large interest from industry and big parties to invest or to get involved in ocean-based or marine CDR. And this is very good. So that gives the companies also the possibility to get started in this and to scale up their activities, which is needed to do the CDR that we want to do. So if we want to deploy all these technologies at scale, we will need large investments, and it takes a lot of effort. So this is the good part. On the other side, as Chris said, we also need to see what is the impact and how can we manage this entire process, also from the legal aspects or on national level from governments. Or in practice, and also to cover all the environmental impacts. And this is where we need to discuss with all the other partners also to see what the other interactions are, and to summarize this in policy briefs and other analysis to give a clear overview of how this could work.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's great. So can you share sort of obviously you've mentioned, legal, regulatory, can you share any of the kind of challenges that these businesses are sharing with you? Any sort of early insights from the engagement you've been doing?
Well, actually, that will be coming up very soon. We're now starting to get involved with some companies. We'll be having a meeting soon in a couple of months. Where we'll be sitting around the table with companies. And as Chris said earlier, the discussion is not an endorsement or not a support of their activities, but just to understand exactly basically your question. So what are their needs, and what framework could they need for them to operate in, and what framework could there be from the legal side or policy side to guide all this. We'll be having these discussions soon, and this is why we also have the World Ocean Council on board to be the interface to these companies and to steer these discussions also a little bit.
Absolutely, and just to sort of drive this clarification, the legal and governance framework work that was being conducted by our partners in Lewis in Italy and Case in Poland and the European University Institute in Florence, they are not seeking to develop the frameworks for implementation for these companies. They're actually seeking to better understand what the decision makers, the policymakers' requirements are, where the gaps are in their existing frameworks. A lot of this has been done in the EU context. We've got the SEAO2-CDR, and there are some guidance for a lot of the terrestrial approaches, but it's a very different environment when you look at the marine realm. There's lots of like fisheries policy. There's lots of kind of other agreements in place that would need to be considered when implementing marine CDR. So it's really kind of understanding if or how, where marine CDR implementation will fit in within those existing frameworks, what the considerations would then need to be for engagement or considerations alongside other maritime users. So that's the context in which we're doing that work. Then the sort of commercial implementation side, obviously companies are, our key understanding there is to understand what the barriers to implementation are, what they see as the next big gaps, and how we can sort of advocate, raise those barriers and sort of understand what needs to be overcome in order to sort of take the next step towards implementation, recognizing that something needs to be done to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So in that context, we're sort of talking to companies, and some of the key issues right now is obviously relates to funding for them, investment strategies, and the investors are recognizing that they need independent confirmation of efficacy of the approach and their lack of impacts. But the companies themselves then can't get their funding to drive that next level of investment, which is where we actually sort of need this independent funding through governments, through research projects, through future independent research funding to really better understand what those impacts might be and how effective these approaches might be if implemented at scales which the companies and the climatic kind of requirements are demanding.
All right, it sounds hugely complex. And you're dealing with all this, you're dealing with all this on a global level, am I right?
Marine CDR is obviously a global question. The ocean is global. A lot of the work we are doing, this is a Horizon Europe funding project. We are obviously focusing on European waters and the techniques that could be or are being looked at for implementation within European setting. That said, implementation of marine CDR naturally looks to implementation in international waters. So you're going to have this kind of local coastal context where you'll be dealing with decision makers on a sort of very regional basis, and you have a national context, you have regional context, and then you've got the international waters. So it is applicable in a global context, and we are naturally looking to these field trials that are happening internationally because we're just starting to get going with some small scale trials within Europe and as well as here in the UK. So we're kind of starting to look that way, but I think that certainly it is international in scope for looking at current projects.
All right, and are you engaging with policy makers as well at the same time?
Absolutely, yes. So one of the, as we mentioned before, one of the sort of key outcomes we want to get from this project is to provide relevant and pertinent advice to policymakers, to decision makers, as well as to the public, as well as to academics, as well as to businesses. So kind of the communities we wish to engage with are very multidimensional, very cross-sectoral. We will be producing throughout the project policy briefs targeting those different users and enabling to digest and understand the information of what is a rapidly growing, rapidly changing sector. The needs are not what they were when we started out on the project. And when we, at the time we initiated the proposal, there wasn't an equivalent way for them to get everyone together. I think that is now evolving. But the policy requirements more or less remain the same, that there are government bodies and decision makers here in the UK and in Europe who are looking for guidance on what the mechanisms are needed, how best to implement marine CDR, if to implement CDR, how to monitor the impacts of marine CDR, and kind of that's where we're trying to give guidance, not to say it must be done or mustn't be done in a certain way. That's not our function. Our function is to say this is what the current status of our understanding is, and this is what we think should be done. But again, it can be targeted and taken as best it can in the needs of the sector right now.
All right, yeah. So, and is there anything obviously, I imagine from the policymakers' side, it is, as you've indicated, it's incredibly complex for them to kind of understand best practices and so on, perhaps especially as those best practices have perhaps not been established. Can you share anything of the sort of challenges they've shared with you so far, through your engagement or anything like that?
Yeah, in terms of discussions we've had, so and sort of just this is a topical discussion. Just a few months ago, there was a big event held in Brussels by the Negative Emissions Platform that kind of really shone a highlight on CDR considerations in general, including marine CDR. In the UK, we've been able to talk to colleagues. Actually, the all-party parliamentary group really recently had a consultation inquiry into ocean-based climate solutions. They've actually produced a document with recommendations, including looking at blue carbon and highlighting the need for the UK government to pay more attention to the oceans and to better understand and fund work into this space. So it is a key area of interest and concern for decision makers in all national governments. I think the discussions really is the fact that there's not a clear precedent to follow. This is a new sector. They are trying to understand, from a decision-making perspective, how this would sit in with other users, what the key barriers that they need to consider when monitoring this, including public perception. Just because something might work doesn't mean it should then be implemented. We need to consider the communities as a function of the ocean, as well as the organisms that live in it. So we need to sort of consider all aspects here. And I think kind of this is not going to be a quick fix. It's going to vary with different locations. It's going to vary with different requirements, different political needs and views and perspectives. So I think we kind of need to recognize that even if the oceans do, which they do have the potential to absorb more CO2, the question is, where and how we will start to see this implemented will vary considerably between countries as a function of how willing they are to engage in this space. And kind of, again, this project is really to help guide sort of frameworks and approaches that could be used in that mechanism. And really, we're just approaching our midway point now. Over the next 2 years, we'll be really sort of ramping up our activity in that space to sort of transmit and share the information that we are and will be generating.
Yes, exactly. And also the actual questions that people on policy level have, those will come from the interviews that we'll have with those people, and they're happening now or will be starting very soon. And from those interviews, we'll get the actual questions that they're facing, and that maybe we can have an answer to, or a start of an answer, a pathway to the answer. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned societal acceptance a couple of times, and I guess that's the kind of third missing piece of the puzzle, isn't it? Especially perhaps as these technologies start to ramp up, as they start to be deployed in specific locations. So what kind of findings do you have so far? What engagement, and how are you ensuring that transparency throughout this process? Because that's very important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And again, our function here is not to advocate for these techniques. We're not here trying to say, trying to be clear about what marine CDR is and try and get people on side for its implementation. Our role here is to understand what people view or what they consider towards marine CDR, and then to give decision makers to raise awareness of what marine CDR is and what it could do, but also what the impacts might be. So we're trying to just be clear and open and to facilitate that transparency rather than to drive forward for its potential for implementation. In terms of, sorry, Willem, did you want to?
Well, and also to identify which aspects in the communication are relevant for the people to make up their opinion or make up their minds or form a view of what the technique is about, and that is then what the policymakers can use to inform the people to come to proper decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And many of our colleagues in Kiel and in Cambridge who are working on this space as we speak, they've been involved in previous work looking at CDR techniques and implementation strategies. And I think based on that previous research, there is a general perception that the oceans are pristine and should not be tampered with or used in this regard. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The oceans are very much impacted by climate change, and will be. We're already seeing that, but human impacts of human activities, beyond climate change is obviously microplastics or plastics in general, and lots of other contaminants and waste just end up in the oceans. So unfortunately, they are no longer pristine. That doesn't, of course, then equate to, well, we should necessarily implement oceans and these strategies anyway. It will vary by location, it will vary by approach, it will vary by community. So we need to recognize this, we need to understand what those perceptions are, and ultimately for any potential marine CDR techniques is going to be implemented, there is a clear and critical need to talk to those communities at the point of implementation before you even start to sort of develop it. You need to understand, make sure the community understand and are on board with this before you sort of seek potential implementations. We've seen some companies fail in initiation of some of these field trials because of community perceptions and community pushback on the approach that's been taken. So there's some important lessons to be learned there for the marine CDR sector. But we've also seen some successful examples of engagement, and communities are very much on board. So I think this is kind of speaks to the complexities of human perceptions and engagement with the ocean. It is a sensitive topic. The oceans do have huge potential to help tackle climate change, which is why there's so much interest in this sector right now. But it does need to be conducted in an appropriate and fully community engagement approach.
All right. Yeah, I think there's the potential to kind of exacerbate existing inequalities, isn't it, if this isn't done right? I mean, with all climate change sort of mitigation approaches, really. All right, so
and I think also some of the measures that we could take, some of the technology really plays in areas that are important for people, that they come off to the beach or whichever part it will be implemented. So it's important for people to be informed properly, and in this project we investigate how they what that could look like. So what works for them, and we'll feed that back to also to the policymakers, but also to companies getting involved in this. Yes.
All right. Could you give me perhaps a couple of practical examples? Chris, you talked about, a time that a trial didn't work because lack of community engagement, other times that there's been a positive response. Could you go into a little detail about that? Obviously not naming any names, the technologies, where they were being trialed, what were the issues or the positive acceptance from the public, just to understand a little more.
Yeah, I think there's the clear example is a company we're looking to do an ocean alkalinity enhancement trial in southwest of England, in Cornwall. They actually did some initial studies, which were extremely small scale, and they wanted to increase the size of the dosage, just basically try and actually get a signal coming out of a wastewater discharge pipe. This is already something that's highly regulated, was being done with kind of full regulatory permits in place. So there was nothing kind of untoward with the approach that was being taken, and scientifically, there was no significant impact anticipated. This was kind of a natural progression in the skies of the trial being expected. Unfortunately, however, perhaps the community engagement process in an area where wastewater companies are already treated with a high degree of skepticism it wasn't perhaps sufficient or adequate, and as a result of the community pushback against that trial, there was then a sort of higher level pause on activities, further scrutiny, and although the trial was agreed that it could proceed, there was no untoward environmental impacts. It subsequently didn't go ahead, partly because they were finding alternative resources to conduct the alkalinity enhancement with, but also mainly because of the community perceptions towards what the company wanted to do. On the flip side, exactly the same approach, actually exactly the same company have been running a highly successful trial in Canada. In Halifax Bay, they've been doing exactly the same work there, perhaps better community engagement, a slightly different, well, very different setting in terms of how the alkalinity is being applied. It's a power cooling plant rather than a wastewater treatment plant. It's already a highly developed area. So they're very different contextual settings for that trial to be conducted. But it's from a scientific perspective, it's following exactly the same process in terms of giving that information about the efficacy of the approach, how much CO2 is being drawn down, what the wider spread of dispersal material it might be, what the impacts might be. So we're getting crucial scientific information about the potential for that technique to be used as a marine CDR approach. But one trial's gone ahead and the other hasn't, partly because of the communities, partly because of the settings, partly because of different frameworks in which these are being considered. So this kind of all fills into this need to say, look, there's a scientific need for us to sort of progress from the labs into these small-scale control understandings just to better understand if or what might work. But there's also a need to consider where these trials will be done, to engage with the communities appropriately before you even start doing any type of work, and to really make sure that everyone is on board and supportive of this. And this kind of fills back into just what William was referring to, is that although we talk a lot about impacts and the potential for negative consequences of marine CDR, there are actually a lot of positive potentials as well. You know, in addition to obviously tackling climate change, you're talking about job revenue, income revenue. You're talking about utilizing existing infrastructure or repurposing old infrastructure, giving it a new lease of life. There are lots of different ways in which this can be done. Many of the organic approaches may generate material that could be used for beneficial human use. So if you're looking macroalgae, seaweed consumption, there's harvesting as, you know, it might not fall into the carbon dioxide removal approach if we kind of repurpose that and remit the CO2 back in the atmosphere. But I think there are ways in which we can look to the oceans as definitely benefits beyond just tackling climate change. So it's engaging with the communities, engaging with the approach is going to be critical, and we're already starting to see this through some of the trials that are happening.
Yeah, exactly. And also the perception also varies per technology and per area. So one community may be more open to local measures close by, because that's what they know and what that they're familiar with, or they may, for that reason, be opposed to it. At the same time, as Chris said, the ocean is perceived as pristine. Some people are see it as less positive that something will be done there, while other people see it as a better place to do it because it's less close to the area that they're familiar to. So and this varies per region and per area. So it's important to clarify all of this, to understand how that works and how people need to be informed to make a proper decision about what happens in their areas or for their for where they live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's a great answer. Interesting that you mentioned the UK and the kind of waste disposal. I think that's, probably level of public trust is at an all-time low there, I think, after things that have happened in recent years. So you're obviously, it's a hugely complex project, huge scale. You're working with lots of different stakeholders. The last question I wanted to ask you was, what are the challenges in kind of coordinating all that, bringing all those different voices together and ensuring that they're heard?
Well, that's a significant challenge. It's also what we're noticing in the project. The range of disciplines is broad. So we really go from technical expertise to legal experts, experts on public perception. It's very broad. And one aspect is that we need to make sure that we speak the same language. And that sounds simple, but actually all these fields have their own way of discussing things or talking about things, and this needs to be clarified. So that's one thing. Another thing is also, and I think that's also good why you were asking about specific examples for what worked or what didn't work in CDR measures, is that it's not so easy to see how your own piece of the puzzle fits within the whole puzzle, because everything needs to fit together. And a challenge is to understand how, if you work on one aspect, how that relates to the other aspects, and how to connect to that. And we're trying to focus on those discussions and try to. That's also why we'll have the discussions with the companies coming up soon, really to clarify the issues that need to be solved and how everything is connected.
And I think what this means from our side is that you cannot invest enough when it comes to personal alignment. So we have this broad range of cross-disciplinarity, and to invest the time in understanding where every person is coming from, behind their work, behind their own research, and their mindset, that can go a long way into helping broaden the understanding of their impact as a whole in the project. So for us, it's really about looking at each individual partner, where we can help and how we can enhance their overall understanding of this.
All right, that's great. Okay, so is there anything else? Are there any key questions that I haven't asked you, things that you wanted to share, or any key takeaways that you would like to round off with?
I guess for me, the main thing to sort of highlight is just the rapid growth of interest and the rapid growth and advancements in the sector that have happened since we wrote the proposal, since the project started 2 years ago. There have been, I said, it's an exponential increase in the number of companies who are looking to explore or better understand, assess the potential to use oceans in this way. And equally, there's a marked increase in governmental interest and international interest in the potential to use oceans to conduct marine carbon dioxide removal. At this point in time, marine CDR techniques are not well represented in our IPCC climatic scenarios because we don't have the sort of models, integrated assessment approaches to sort of facilitate representation of the marine carbon removal pathways in those models, but also because we don't have the legal regulatory sort of frameworks, the financing mechanisms to enable those that market, that sector sort of to be contributing towards climate mitigation. So we're seeing this huge increase in interest, but we're reaching sort of a crossroads in terms of getting the scientific information to enable that to then sort of proceed forwards. Some of that or much of that information will come from these small scale trials, many of which are being funded and led by companies who are very keen and open to working with academics, which is fantastic. But beyond that, there is a need for marked increase in the sorts of techniques we're looking at through this project, the monitoring, reporting, verification approaches, the life cycle analysis of how effective these approaches will be when you consider them en masse. We've already referred to the community and stakeholder perceptions towards these techniques. What techniques would work better where? Does that align with their scientific applicability? We're talking coastal waters or at sea implementation. What bits will fit where? And I think we need to recognize that just because the oceans cover 2/3 of the planet or 70% of the planet surface doesn't mean you can apply all techniques everywhere equally. We need to better compartmentalize what's going to go where, what can contribute to marine CDR for which countries, and kind of guide the extent to which they will be part of the climate mitigation solution. It's also very important perhaps to highlight, because we haven't mentioned this so far, that CDR, whether on land or at sea, in itself is not going to be the solution. We have to stop emitting fossil fuels. This goes beyond saying, but it's important to emphasize this. This is not a kind of a approach we can just say, oh, we can continue business as usual whilst putting all the CO2 into the oceans. That will not happen. It will not tackle climate change. We have to urgently, rapidly stop the emissions, and the oceans can help with that. There's renewable energy sources, tidal energy, offshore wind, and always potentials for the ocean to help reduce fossil fuel emissions. But what we're looking at here is the potential for them to help tackle and deal with the residual emissions, which is also going to be vitally important in terms of keeping to the Paris Agreement target of limiting future global warming. So it's a really exciting time to be working in this field. There's a lot of growth, a lot of interest, a lot of potential, and really I think projects like SEAO2-CDR are very well placed to help guide where we go next in the sector. And our role is very much to bring the community together to ensure we're all talking the same language, all trying to sort of have that level playing field, level understanding on which to progress from. And it's an exciting couple of years ahead for us.
Yeah, that's also a very exciting time now in the project itself, because all of our experts are now digging into the topics, coming up with the first data that we can discuss. And at the same time, we'll be having the discussions, as I said, very soon, to see how everything fits together. And we can still also align some of the research to make sure that we all align on towards the same targets and come up with an integrated result. So actually, it's now a very exciting time where lots of things are happening outside the field, but also inside the project. And I think having this discussion in 1.5 or 2 years' time will be very interesting to see where we end up by then.
Yeah, that's great. That's a very nice, inspiring way to finish. I would definitely love to check back with you after the project and see how things stand then. All right, so if there's nothing else to add, then Chris, Nicholas, Willem of the SEAO2-CDR project, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.